again to all. A pleasant day to all of you, and welcome to our episode of Facts Talk podcast. This podcast is made possible through the collaboration between Facts Asia and the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung Philippines. I am Diane Carrer. I'm a TV host and news anchor based in the Philippines. Nice to be back here again. Here in Facts Talk, we will examine Europe's strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. And today, we will focus on the developments in ocean governance concerning Indo-Pacific states and the EU foreign policy. The EU in particular aims to work with partners to strengthen ocean governance in the region in full compliance with international law, particularly UNCLOS, to support partners in fighting against IUU fishing, and to implement sustainable fisheries partnership agreements. Joining us today is our very special guest, Attorney Jacqueline Espenilla, Assistant Professor at the UP College of Law and Senior Fellow at the UP Institute for Maritime Affairs and Law of the Sea. Hello and welcome to Facts Talk podcast, Attorney Jackie.
Hello, Diane. I'm very, very happy to be here talking to you all and discussing something which is very close to my heart.
We are excited to learn from you, Attorney Jackie. Now, before we do discuss the third priority area of cooperation, which is about ocean governance, we want to know more about you. You mentioned that the subject matter is very close to your heart, so please tell us briefly what you do and your expertise about our subject matter for today about ocean governance.
Sure. I basically live, breathe, and dream about oceans, specifically oceans law. I'm not a scientist. I'm a lawyer by training. But it is something that is very much a part of my daily life and my teaching and my research. So as a quick background, I teach international law at the University of the Philippines College of Law to law students mostly. But I'm also a member of the Corps of Professors of the Philippine Judicial Academy, where I lecture on international law again, and specifically the law of the sea to our judges. You'd be surprised, but law of the sea, despite us being an archipelagic country, isn't really that common or well known. So it's really an advocacy that I try to push. I also have had the privilege of lecturing members of our armed forces via the Development Academy of the Philippines. I've also had the opportunity to give lectures to fisher folk, especially those who are near Bajo de Masinloc, Scarborough Shoal, for those who may know it by that name. I am a senior fellow at the Institute for Maritime Affairs and Law of the Sea, as you mentioned. That is basically, I guess in a nutshell, the government's think tank for all things maritime. I've been a visiting fellow at 3 institutions. First is the United Nations Division. That's basically a very short, I guess, description of me and what I do. So over to you.
Wow, from the academe, even to the local communities and to different organizations, this is indeed your advocacy. We're excited to learn from you today. Now, Attorney Jackie, focusing this time on ocean governance, how will you define this and why is this important for the EU?
So first, I'm going to give you the textbook meaning. I'm sorry I do this because I'm an educator, and we begin with these things, then we sort of elaborate by giving context to them. So the textbook definition of ocean governance is that it is the integrated conduct of the policy, actions, and affairs regarding the world's oceans to protect the ocean environment and to ensure the sustainable use of coastal and marine resources, as well as to conserve its biodiversity. A lot of words, which I am very sure really means nothing in general. But I'll share with you my practical explanation of it. And this is something that I borrow from one of the mentors that I've had when I was at the UN. And this is Dr. Francois Bellet. He's a senior UN lawyer, and he explained ocean governance to me in this manner. He said that ocean governance is comprised of 3 but distinct and interrelated components. First, there's the legal aspect. So that's the body of laws that might inform the dimensions and dynamics of the oceans. Second, the institutional framework. So this is basically the bodies, the people, the institutions that might give life to these laws. And third, the mechanism for cooperation, recognizing that the oceans are vast, the interests in it are vast as well. Therefore, you have to have sort of an interplay among these actors, these institutions, in order to really get the desired effect of all of these laws together. So these 3 components have to work together in order to take a holistic view of oceans issues. So our priority at the moment is the conservation and sustainable use of ocean resources. And it is actually tied to so many other issues, including things which don't really sound related to the environment, but actually are. These are the more traditional security concerns. The environment sort of sits at the very middle or the very center of all concerns of the ocean. So whether you're more focused on the economic side of things, you still have to have a care for protection of the oceans because necessarily your resources are based there. It has a relationship to security issues as well because resources, again, are tied to space and ownership of space. So that will bring into context all those territorial issues that you often hear about. So it's very you can say it in a sentence, but as you can imagine, it's like an iceberg. There's so many other unsaid things that are related to this concept of ocean governance. So it's really all encompassing and very broad. Understanding this is relevant for the EU because you have to really get a handle of on what forces are at work in this region that it proposes to have a deeper presence in, a stronger influence on. So I speak of the Southeast Asian region, ASEAN, and the Philippines. It means that while there is one idea of what the law is, of course, in the oceans, you can never get away from the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea as sort of the overarching constitution of the oceans. There are many, like I said, sub rules, sub instruments, which are created by different bodies, not necessarily all UN. Some of them are regional in nature, just isolated to us here in Southeast Asia. Some of them are species specific, like just for a kind of fish or for a kind of turtle or something like that. There, like I said, it's fragmented. So much is at play. And each member state in the ASEAN, Philippines included, have different perspectives on this, which is informed specifically by our own national interest. These national interests are tied to our geography, our history, our politics even. So the way that we approach and appreciate the oceans varies a lot. So the EU has to understand that and has to know where sort of the beating heart of the Philippines is, what our national priorities are, and understand what is ocean governance Philippine style. And it's very hard to define that. And only with experience and exposure can you sort of get a feel for where the direction of the tides are for our country.
Attorney Jack, we want to know your views on these questions. First, what can the Indo-Pacific region learn from the EU's experience and approaches? And why is the EU interested to share its experiences through the EU strategy for cooperation?
I will say for the record that many aspects of the EU strategy for cooperation appeal to me. I like the idea of promoting a rules-based international order. I mean, this is necessarily, so I'm a lawyer. We love rules. And I also like the inclusivity aspect of it. I approve of the identified priority areas, including the prioritization of course, of ocean governance. But what we have learned from past experience with the EU, however, is that there is a certain degree of, if I may say this, inflexibility in its implementation of cooperation and engagement. And this is sort of a double-edged sword, which I think is important to sort of flesh out in this discussion. You know the carrot and stick approach in behavioral management? The carrot is the motivation by incentive, and the stick is motivation due to a desire to avoid punishment or consequences. With the Philippines, the EU has taken more of a stick approach with ocean governance issues. And I can give you two clear examples. First is the issue of IUU fishing. That's illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. So to give you a bit of background, I think in June 2014, the EU threatened to ban fish imports from the Philippines. In 2014, the EU imposed what is known as a yellow card warning. I'm really not a sports person, but I think in soccer they do a football. Sorry, EU term. So in football, they give a yellow card to players who misbehave. It's sort of like a warning, and if you do not shape up or if you do not fix your behavior, then that yellow card turns into a red card and you get kicked out of the game. That was essentially what the EU was planning to do. It gave the Philippine fisheries a yellow card warning, telling us that, look, Philippines, your fisheries policies are not in line with international and EU standards. Therefore, this is a warning to you. If you do not fix your regulatory laws, you do not fix your enforcement and your punishment system, then you will be given a red card eventually and you will be banned from the EU market. In principle, that means the Philippines, who at the time considered the EU its biggest export market for fisheries and seafood products, would be cut off from that. We would not be able to export our seafood products to the EU if that yellow turned to red and we are banned from the EU market. So you can really imagine what a big deal that was, because it would be a huge economic blow to the Philippines.
I agree. The issue of IUU is indeed a huge issue in the country, but has not received a lot of attention prior EU's yellow card warning.
Because of this 2014 warning, the Philippines really sort of woke up and decided to do something about it. They wanted to avert disaster, basically, yellow turning into red. So in the span of a year, the Philippines did something unprecedented. It revisited its 1998 fisheries code for the first time in almost 20 years, and basically did a total overhaul of it so that we would be able to be more compliant with EU standards, and we would be more compliant with international standards as well. So that was important because here you can really see the direct link between EU and the Philippines, and the kind of change or power that the EU could wield in sort of instigating positive change in the Philippines. Although, of course, the modality by which they affected this change was using a stick, the threat of punishment. So like I said, it's a double-edged sword. You can view it as you will. Is it a good thing? Do we welcome being threatened like that? Or do we just look at the end result, which was that we did need to overhaul our law? It's just that we needed sort of some push towards that direction. And the EU directive, the EU yellow card, was that much needed push. As a result, our fisheries code got massive amendments, and now we have the so-called RA 10654, otherwise known as the IUU fishing law. Under RA 10654, a lot of changes happened, which the EU welcomed. So one important change was first, now under this new amendment, penalties for illegal acts of fishing and all those things that I mentioned are now much higher. Under the amendments, we wanted to curb these illegal practices by making the penalty painful. So now we're talking in the millions of pesos for doing something which once upon a time would only net you a 5,000 peso penalty fine. In addition to that, there would now be a criminal penalty as well, jail time, if you engage in these things. Another important innovation, and one we can directly attribute to the EU's warning, was we are now implementing a so-called vessel monitoring system, or VMS. When fishing vessels go out into the water, it's a big space. You don't really have a sense of where they may go, where they may fish, and what they will be doing out there. You cannot have eyes everywhere. And vessel monitoring allows you to use and leverage the power of satellite technology to be able to track the movements of fishing vessels after a certain size. So it's a significant help in enforcement, the enforcement capacity of our government. So before the amendments, there was nothing like that, even though we did have commitments under the international community to do something like that. But again, it was the push that was done by the EU that sort of really fast-tracked this process of setting up a nationwide system for vessel monitoring. I will say, however, we're not yet fully there. We started the process, but because it's expensive and is very technical, it requires people knowing how to do it and utilize that data, we haven't fully rolled it out yet. So now we are able to identify, or we put systems in place that will help us identify and give EU and other markets for our fisheries and seafoods products that kind of information, making it that much easier for us to facilitate our seafood trade. Good news is that in 2015, just a year and then some later, the EU lifted its yellow card warning. We were once again welcomed with open arms into the EU market. And this was a feat, by the way, because like I said, we were not the only country that was given a yellow card, but we were the fastest ones to lift that yellow card. And as a result of that, we were effectively delisted from that warning list. And once again, we're all good in terms of our relationship with the EU for fisheries and seafood trade. The second thing that I wanted to talk about that answers the question of what lessons we've learned, and this is another stick approach of the EU. This has to do with the more recent issue of Filipino seafarers. Philippines is one of the top maritime labor supplying countries in the world, and many EU flagged vessels actually have Filipinos on board. So you can imagine it is of two-way interest for us, this issue of shipping labor, maritime labor.
Undoubtedly, that is indeed a new development in regard to our seafarers.
For the EU, because they need Filipino talent to keep their vessels afloat and moving, especially during these difficult times of the pandemic. And from the Philippine side, because of the economic impact, of course, of seafarers sending remittances and the salaries that they earn. So, because of this significant interest that this seafaring presents for the EU, it actually does conduct regular investigations, regular assessments of the Philippines, and it's not just the Philippines, but all countries it has similar dealings with via the European Maritime Safety Agency. So as early as 2006, or maybe earlier, if I'm not mistaken, EU has been checking up on the skills and capacities of Filipino seafarers to make sure that they are compliant with global and European standards, similar to what they did with fishing and IUU. But in March 2020, it didn't quite turn out so well for the Philippines. So that in the following this year, the 2021, the EU issued a warning again to the Philippines. No yellow cards this time, but just a straightforward warning. Look, Philippines, your standards for seafarer training are really insufficient. It does not even comply with what is known as the International Convention on Standards of Training, Certification, and Watchkeeping for Seafarers, or the STCW Convention. So we adhere to that, of course, as a major seafarers supplying nation, rather. Before there was an STCW convention setting out these basic global minimum standards, there wasn't any. And every country sort of had their own thing going. So there had to be some intervention at the international level. So that basic standard is crucial to keep everything nice and smooth and going with minimum harm to everybody. So it's our interest to adhere to that. Problem is, the Philippines has not been. We have, as a result of many factors, I'll not elaborate here, have been non-compliant with many aspects of this. So in that 2020 and 2021 audit report by the EU, they found what is known as grievances. They found 23 grievances or non-compliant acts of the Philippines to the STCW. The point of the matter is, basic things like that, we didn't really spend a lot of time, money, and resources on. Clearly, it meant that Filipino seafarers are now being branded as insufficient and lacking in proper training. That's bad. Because once that kind of reputation gets out, of course, it would be a blow to our export market for seafarers. So, EU gave us a warning about that, again, with the following threat that if you don't shape up, then you would also be banned from sending seafarers to the EU, a stick once again. So, as in the case of IUU fishing, the Philippines took this warning really seriously. But the time period is much shorter. So, the Philippines was given 3 to 5 months to sort of respond to the EU and give some reasonable explanation, or at least a plan of action that it would undertake in order to fix its training deficiencies and capacity deficiencies. The Philippines was able to come up with a plan, not yet fully implemented. Of course, it's only been a couple of months since that warning came out. So in fairness to the EU, in late March of, I think, or April of this year, 2023, the European Commission announced that it would continue recognizing the certificates, the STCW certificates of Filipino seafarers. In other words, yes, we warned you, but we won't go too hard on you for now because you guys seem to be sincere in changing direction and making improvements. So we were not banned, in other words, from the EU market for our seafarers. So we learned that. we learned that that's how we engage with the EU. They have, again, their EU really advocates a rules-based international order anchored on all of these conventions, their internal domestic policies. So I think I've answered the question a lot, but I hope you will allow me now to rephrase the question so that it will be in reverse. What can the EU learn from the Philippines and the ASEAN's experience and approaches? Southeast Asia and ASEAN member states like the Philippines are very in demand at the moment for external partners, not just the EU. So the EU is not alone in expressing its interest and desire for deeper cooperation in this space of the world. So you have the US, you have Australia, Japan, India, UK, in fact, indeed, G7 generally. All expressing interest in exactly the same manner. And because of this being in demand, you can imagine now, for once, Southeast Asian countries, including the Philippines, have the luxury of choice of partners and projects that they can take. This dynamic is something that the EU should keep in mind and learn from that as it continues to deepen and expand its connections in the Philippines. This means that its strategy for cooperation with the Philippines, or indeed any ASEAN state, should be complementary, if not consistent with these initiatives and programs of other partners. In other words, the EU has to make it as easy as possible for the Philippines to want a partnership and not create issues of preference and choice amongst its allies and partners. So we want to create some sort of synergy here. And I guess that's what the EU has to learn from the Philippines.
All right. Well, wow, so many developments just from the cooperation between EU and ASEAN member states. Yet we know so much more needs to be done. Now, moving on to a matter close to our hearts, Attorney Jackie, we want to know your view on how the territorial disputes in the South China Sea affect dialogue and implementation efforts between the EU and the region. How can the EU support ASEAN-led processes in the discussions of the South China Sea Code of Conduct? And do you think it can also use stick diplomacy when engaging with China, Attorney?
Because first, you have to understand where we are in the negotiation process for the Code of Conduct. It is nowhere near the finish line, unfortunately. Again, I've had the privilege of being part of those processes, those conversations. Of course, I'm not at liberty to disclose exactly where we are now in the negotiations, but what I can say definitely is that there are still a lot of unresolved issues, even among ASEAN member states. So in my personal opinion, I think it would be very difficult to insist that the EU take a particular stance on something that is yet unsettled. I mean, the very basic idea of having a binding code of conduct suddenly is already in question. Once upon a time, all ASEAN member states felt that this was necessary. But as time went by in this negotiation process, there have been some countries which are not as keen on the idea anymore, for various personal strategic reasons as well. And then, like I said, there are still controversial positions within this code of conduct that touches on behavior in the South China Sea, which could include things like fishing, even sail-throughs, all those sorts of things. So nothing is settled at this point. So it may be difficult to say that we demand or expect the EU to take a firm position on it. At the bare minimum, the EU certainly can be a little bit more vocal in supporting the arbitral award. At the very least, this is consistent with its position that they uphold a rules-based international order. And we know certainly that the arbitral award was done in accordance with the provisions of the UNCLOS. And we know that the victory, because indeed that is what it is, that the Philippines won out of that process, is something that is legally sound, and certainly not up for debate at this point. So China, of course, wants to sort of muddy this reality by not recognizing the process, not recognizing the award. But in any case, every voice in support of this legally binding process and the legally binding award is important. So now it cannot be. It cannot be that there are fence sitters. It cannot be that there are countries who stand by silent, letting the rule of law sort of be set aside. So the EU can actually have a lot of influence in the global stage if it is one of the voices that chimes in support of the South China Sea arbitration.
Now, Attorney Jackie, what are the distinctive features for cooperation and or hard connectivity and soft connectivity potentials that may contribute to better cooperation between European states in the Indo-Pacific region?
The EU here has a role to play in facilitating compliance. They are the rule makers, or at the very least, the rule enforcers in relation to this STCW Global Convention. The European Union, via the EC, can provide the Philippines, for example, with technical assistance to further improve its education, training, and certification system for seafarers. It makes practical sense for both sides, both for EU and for the Philippines. This is why we are being criticized and informed that we may be banned from the EU market. But the best way to sort of make a concrete stride forward is to give us the tools or to give us the assistance needed for us to help ourselves, to be able to realign our training practices if we have facilities that can better give our seafarers the opportunity to meet the EU standards. I think that can be the fastest and most constructive soft connectivity approach that the EU can take in relation to this issue. With respect to fishing and the IUU fishing concerns of the EU, again, technical assistance here is key. In particular, with respect to what I mentioned earlier, vessel monitoring system. The EU is very sophisticated in how it tracks fish and fishing activities within its jurisdictional waters. They have all these satellites. They have they can harness the resources of all of its member states. Philippines, big ocean, few resources. And this is where the EU can really leverage its resources and experience and technical know-how to help us improve our own capacity to police ourselves. So it can be in training Filipino government people and law enforcers in using satellite data, making sense of what it actually might imply, factoring it into its processes, and really maximizing how they will be able to conduct monitoring and control and surveillance activities in the waters. By the way, again, even though I'm just discussing ocean governance issues, this could actually have a dual purpose, one that is more strategic in nature. You need eyes in the water, so to speak, in order to be able to better forecast and safeguard against territorial threats. In the same way that we are mostly blind with respect to IUU fishing, we are also blind with respect to these strategic territorial threats. So assistance in relation to satellite surveillance, vessel monitoring could also serve that purpose. So hitting two birds with one stone. So it would be a very, very good point of soft connectivity for the EU if it would be willing to give that kind of technical assistance, training, and resources to the Philippines. And as always, this is what I realized in all my conversations with diplomats from not just the EU, but other countries and potential partners of the Philippines. The line always is that we are doing a lot for the Philippines. We are giving a lot. But the problem is, and what I observe is that there isn't much publicity. There isn't much hype, if I can use that word, in relation to how they are helping the Philippines. So yes, you may have it in your portfolios. You may be able to report at the end of the year that we gave so and so, but how it tells you a lot if it is not felt. Maybe there is a need to assess where the disconnect lies, whether maybe you're hitting the wrong policy area or the wrong program space, or maybe it's just a simple matter of being able to get out there and communicate with governments, with the publics, that this is indeed help and assistance coming from the EU and its member states. And in that sense, you could create a stronger connection and forge a better partnership if there is that consistent awareness that the EU is here and it is really committed to the Philippines.
Last but definitely not the least, Attorney, what are the challenges in the strategy for cooperation in ocean governance?
Okay. I think, well, there are a lot of challenges, but if I were to start somewhere, at least in relation to the EU, I think it would really have to be trust building. Again, this stems from an assumption that there could certainly be more, or insofar as deepening the EU-Philippine relationship. I attribute this lack of, full and comprehensive trust on two things. Number one, Again, it's probably because of the choice of policy tool that the EU sometimes uses. I think you may know that in the previous administration didn't take too kindly to being criticized for the manner in which it conducted its anti-drug war. I do not agree with that anti-drug war, certainly, but as an academic observer, I can immediately see sort of the knee-jerk reaction of that administration to criticisms from the EU. So there was a conscious decoupling, if I may borrow a pop cultural term, from the EU during that previous administration. So there is some kind of relationship then, but now it needs to be repaired a little bit, insofar as sort of reforging those ties that were sort of put on hold or paused during that previous administration, and also during the pandemic. We cannot deny that there was sort of a quieting of conversations all over the world, not just between the EU and the Philippines. So we have to get to know each other again, so to speak, to understand where we are now, each as entities, as the Philippines as a middle income developing country, the EU and its member states as a developed country with a lot of keen interest in the region. We have to understand each other's policy directions under our respective new administrations, and also to figure out where we will be of most service to each other. So it's really that idea that you need to build trust and get to know each other better. This is a major challenge, I think, that has to be overcome. The Philippines right now is sort of emerging from its sort of tunnel vision with respect to how it treats its international relations. Again, during the previous administration, we were a little bit preoccupied with China and forging a relationship with China. Now I think we're adopting and more consistent with previous administrations, a more balanced sense of diplomacy, balanced connections with other states. That means that we are open for business. We are open for partnerships. But to get to a point where that means something that is lasting and significant, we have to have that kind of trust first.
On that note, we'd like to thank you, Attorney Jacqueline Espenilla. Thank you for sharing your expertise and your views. Marami pong salamat.
Thank you, Diane. It has been my absolute pleasure to share a little bit of the things that I am interested in, I love, and I think is relevant for all Filipinos.
We did learn a lot from you, Attorney Jackie. Thank you again. Ocean governance is indeed a very fragmented issue. The Philippines, as an archipelago, still has a long way to go in strengthening IUU initiatives and improving standards in seafaring. But as you mentioned, the EU and its member states have a keen interest in the region, and we can certainly identify ways to further forge cooperation. Again, we learned a lot from Attorney Jackie. Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank all of you, our listeners, who joined us today. If you loved and learned from this podcast, please share this episode with your friends and colleagues. Also, if you missed our second episode, you may also listen to the previous episodes also here on Spotify. We invite you as well to like and follow Fax Asia official social media accounts, facebook.com/FaxAsia on Facebook and at FaxAsia.org on Twitter. You may also visit our website, www.faxasia.org, to stay updated on our projects. That's all for now. Again, this is your host, Diane Kidder. Until the next episode of Fax Talk.